Hi there, and welcome to today's edition of the GOTO Book Club. My name's Damian Maclennan. I'm a consultant CTO and software architecture trainer with a company called Stack Mechanics, and I'm based in Brisbane, Australia. Today I'm talking with a fellow Australian and Brisbaneite, Ashley Davis. He's recently released second edition of his book, Bootstrapping Microservices, with Docker, Kubernetes, GitHub Actions, and Terraform. So Ashley, why don't you tell me a little bit about your background in the software industry and what led you to write this book?
Well, first of all, thank you for joining me, Damian. I know that you've got a long history in kind of what we're going to be talking about today as well. So really, really excited to talk to you about it. I've been a developer for over a quarter of a century now. So, I've been around a bit. I've done all the languages, at least. Hopefully all the important ones. So I've worked across a bunch of domains, worked for a whole bunch of different size companies from startups to the biggest internationals, and worked with a lot of different, ways of structuring software, and microservices, or I think more appropriately, distributed applications is, mostly where I'm at now. Although, I still consider myself, I've spent a lot of time in startups, so I'm a constant dabbler in like anything and everything you can imagine. So I work across.
And you have to be to maintain a career of length. You have to be a constant dabbler and always reinventing, right?
Yeah. So like front end, back end. Love some of the problems that sort of come into play in distributed applications. Really interesting stuff, interesting problems to get your head around and to find, solutions that only add as much complexity as is needed to kind of manage the complexity, really, and to keep it just simple enough, not to over engineer it, basically. So we have complicated problems to solve, and trying to solve them in ever more simpler but more effective ways.
Which kind of leads me to, and I want to dive right into some of the sort of nitty gritty of microservices, but your first edition came out in January 2021, which is a little over 3 years ago. So what brought about you writing the second edition? Was it industry trends? Was it based on feedback, or just an update of the tools and better techniques that you saw out there?
Yeah, I mean, you don't get to write a second edition unless the book's popular in the first place. So there was that, and having microservices on the cover helps with that. Even though it's a book for working with any kind of distributed application, really, and microservices is just one end of the extreme, of choices, which I'd like to talk about some more as well. But
absolutely.
So so Manning, who I've worked for on a few books, came back and asked me to do a second edition, and I'd loved working on that book, and I didn't, nothing like that is ever finished. You just at some point you kind of have to say,
ship it.
This is enough.
It's like software.
Ship it, and so I had feedback coming in while I was writing it that I couldn't address. I had feedback coming in after I'd published it, because if people reach out to me, I'm always happy if I can, fit in the time to actually jump on a call and, talk people through like what they're trying to achieve and, like why they're having trouble, if they're having trouble. And so I got a lot of feedback that way as well, and made a lot of interesting connections with people that way. And then, things changed, things changed in the industry. Software was updated. Terraform reached version 1. Docker's been around for a long time, but when I first started writing the book, I wasn't sure whether Kubernetes was really going to be, like the king of microservices or the king of distributed applications. And it seems, as much as I can tell, that it is now, at least. So there was, I put, and since I wrote the first edition, I became, I got a qualification in terms of becoming like a certified Kubernetes developer. So I'd really pushed my experience with Kubernetes like further along, done a lot more stuff in production as well. So all that influenced it. And also I found simpler ways of doing things. So in the first edition, some of the examples are more complicated than they needed to be. And And through writing the second edition, I was able to kind of come back, revisit that, and simplify it. And it's still effectively the same result, but just code and examples that are a little bit simpler. And and hopefully I've come up with because I think about it again and get a chance to kind of revise it and go through all the whole feedback process as well that Manning organised, which is a really great way of writing a book. The explanations are hopefully better, are clearer, and are more to the point. And so doing
that's the thing when you explain the same concepts over and over again, you come up with shortcuts to saying things. You come up with better analogies, and so it's something that I'm certainly familiar with as well. And like you said, a lot of the tooling's improved. So some hoops you may have had to jump through 4 years ago, there's a shortcut for them now. So fantastic.
Sure. And so it's all about finding better ways to do things, more effective ways to do things. And for me also, it's, finding more effective ways to teach things in terms of the writing of the book.
Absolutely. So as an architectural style, microservices have gone through the full hype cycle. We had the sort of really early adopters. They gained some real traction, saw some, a lot of real world usage, and then everyone wanted to jump on that bandwagon. Some of those people learned some very expensive and very painful lessons. Then we see people a little bit more hesitant, and when is a microservice architecture the right choice? Like, what makes a good candidate for a microservices architecture?
Like, that's a really hard question to answer in a general way. Not everything needs to be microservices. I mean, I think part of the problem maybe is that microservices have been pushed on a lot of people, and developers have been forced to use microservices in situations that didn't call for it. So I think you've got to think really really deeply about whether microservices are the right answer to your question. And I'm actually, I want to talk about this more in a bit, but I'm somewhere sort of more in the middle now. So like, if you ask me microservices or monolith, I'll say somewhere in the middle. I think it's a great place to be to basically get the most out of both those different ways of working. And then you get to choose to use microservices for features or for aspects of the application where it matters. So it's not like saying, here's an app and you should definitely use microservices for everything. It's like, here's an app and it's structured in such a way that things that can make use of the benefits of microservices can be spun out into separate services. And I've got like a list of examples of things that have worked really well for me in production applications that I've built. Like, I've worked on a couple of different applications that needed to run AI models. So pre-trained AI models, like, something you load up into TensorFlow. And not only does that maybe the tech stack you have to use for that conflict maybe with the tech stack you actually want to use for the customer endpoints that the customers are directly talking to kind of use the web application or the mobile application or whatever it is the backend's talking to. So you want to, for those AI models, we always wanted them to be separate. It was just like it was so obvious that you want to spin an AI model out into a separate service, because then you can kind of control the performance of it and the problems that it has. Like, you can have some sort of fault isolation. So if you spin that kind of thing out to a separate service, you can scale it, you can throw a GPU at it, you can prevent any problems that are happening there aren't going to be affecting the customer. So I think that was one of the first things that I was like, this is, a place where it's cut and dry. You can put this kind of thing in a microservice and, run a dozen of them, as many as you need to kind of get throughput.
It's a great use case. Any computationally or time expensive processing that you can offload onto an ASIC process and build it into an isolated space that's fault tolerant and not so time sensitive is going to make your general app scale better, perform better, right? It's a sort of an easy win.
One of the applications I worked on, one of the ones that had AI models in it, was a general kind of asset processing system. Like, you could, as an extreme example, you could upload a video to it, and then the video would, there would be a process that could chop up the frames of the video, do AI analysis on individual frames, pick a thumbnail for the video at somewhere in the video.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an example of something that could be quite performance intensive, that if you're set up in the right way to use microservices, even if you've got a monolith, even if you've got like most of your stuff's in a monolith, you can kind of spin this one thing out to a microservice, and suddenly, your performance problems are gone, and you can kind of keep that separate. You can run it at a really low priority if you want to save money, or you can spin up 10 of them if you want to get the throughput.
Yep.
So again, performance, fault isolation, and we had say like 20 of these services that could handle different types of assets and do different kinds of processing on them. Like you would upload an audio file, and it would spin off a service that could do the transcription of it. So that was just talking to something in AWS and basically waiting for a transcription to come back. But there was just something that you could kind of like hold off from everything else basically, and keep it at a distance, as it were. So that kind of thing worked really well. I've worked for blockchain companies, and there's a need for security and kind of ring fencing certain transactions on the blockchain, or ring fencing any data that's any financial data or any kind of keys or secrets that you don't necessarily want the rest of the wider organization to be able to access, like the security reasons to spin off things like that in separate services as well.
So that's a really good example. I've had some similar experience working in a compliance space where we had sensitive data, and again, through building that off into separate services, we could completely isolate and ring fence around that data. So it's a really good example.
And of course, there's reasons to use microservices for reusability and composing systems together as well. I would say never do that just for that reason. Like don't split up a microservice just because you think it might be good to reuse it. It's like, in any kind of coding, you can always go overboard with like componentizing things or creating abstraction layers and stuff like that. But I mean, a really good example I've got here is like having a separate service for doing email notifications or something like that, or like SMS notifications, because that's something that possibly a lot of other services in your system want to reuse. And so it makes sense to kind of spin that out as a separate service. But I like I said, I would never do that just because it's good for reusability. Like it has to be that there is a need for that reusability. Not
that's right. Any good abstraction is going to come from working software. If you start with the library or the framework or the service first, you're very likely to get that modeling entirely wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So that kind of thing, I think, can come as you build it, like because you've got other reasons, like what we've talked about for performance or fault isolation or security reasons. And I mean, there's a list of benefits, right, to using microservices.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if we want to kind of tread that path.
Well, yeah. So what haven't we covered? We've covered performance. We've covered security and compliance. We've covered isolation. We've covered reuse. Do you see any others?
Yeah, well, on my list of benefits, where these are personally my top two, and there's like a world of discussion probably under each of these, but one is that I really love, that I don't know how well it's appreciated or kind of understood by people, is being able to build a system or design a system so that you can kind of replace it over time. And so that's really hard to do with a monolith. Like with a monolith,
yes.
You're stuck with what you've got for a long, if it's successful,
versions of frameworks and
yeah. But with microservices, anything that you've carved up into separate processes, then you've got like basically a way forward in terms of like, okay, that replacing them one at a time with whatever, like if it's changing the tech stack to something newer, it's just like done really badly. Like each service,
Yes.
One thing I love is that microservices can be like little islands of tech debt, like,
but it's encapsulated tech debt, right? It's like it's isolated tech debt. No,
that's right, and it's already set up so that you can kind of throw a piece of it away and replace it with something better.
Yeah, and like you said, even just like framework versions, and Docker makes that really easy, because it used to be if you wanted to upgrade a framework version in an organization, you would have to upgrade every build server and every developer machine, and your build chains would have to change. And now you can just say, okay, well, I'm touching this service today, so I'm going to bring it to the latest, and I'll bring it to the latest Docker image to host it on. And that's a very isolated change, and it doesn't affect all of the other things. So you never have those let's rev the entire enterprise projects, which are awful.
Obviously, there's some anti-patterns that can break that, which I think we'll talk about soon. But yeah, just being able to design the system, so that the parts of it can be evolved over time in a way that the system itself doesn't break. So I think, and you can keep it running. While you do that, you can basically hot swap in new services for old services. You can add, if you've got a protocol like what I was talking about before with the asset processing, you can have a running system and you can add new types of asset processing to it on the fly by creating and deploying a new microservice.
Absolutely. So one thing we haven't touched on that is a real benefit is the people side of it, in that you can have smaller teams that, if you've got your general modeling right, can work on a small piece that has, it might have some technical debt, but it's isolated technical debt. You don't need to understand the side effects of the entire enterprise to work on the one service. You can kind of fit that domain problem in your head quite nicely.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, like one of the common benefits that we're probably not even going to talk about is, microservices allow not just scalability for performance and that for the granular tunability of performance, but scalability of the team
of people.
and having a team of teams. Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, that was just on my list of benefits to skip over, to be honest, because I think that's...
Yeah, I mean, it's not appropriate for everybody. Like these patterns, like you said, can be used by anybody, but certainly in much bigger organizations, so long as there's some sensible thinking around how you do that, it certainly lets you scale up your development organization.
So the other thing that I wanted to cover, like just on the last thing really on the benefits, is that microservices, a lot of people think they cause complexity. A lot of people think, I'm not going to use microservices because they're going to make things more complex. Like, I've got bad news for those people, because applications get complex no matter like what happens. Like they're gonna tend towards complexity in a big organization, a big company that's got a huge customer base. So I don't think you can avoid complexity. Like you just need to find ways to manage it so that it doesn't really stunt your development process and stunt your release cycle.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where microservices can really help is to help you manage that complexity. So it's like taking something that is going to be very, very complicated and chopping it up into smaller, simpler, manageable parts.
And I think there's some techniques for that, and I actually want to get into that in a moment. I've got one more question first, but a lot of that is in how you structure your development environment and how you structure your code base. And I know you've got some really good stuff in the book about it, so I might come back to that in a moment. But let's take it to a slightly dark place first. We've talked about the benefits and we've talked about hype cycle. I know, and there's a lot of people out there that have had some fairly expensive failures and some messy lessons. What are the main pitfalls that you see out there?
I think, microservices, like I've said up front, they're not suitable for every project. They're not suitable for every team or every use case. It's like, if you've got to think really carefully about, the costs versus the benefits. So you've got to basically justify whether microservices are going to deliver value. And if they deliver more value than they cost you in terms of investment, maintenance, skilling up, and management of the tech and stuff like that, then they're going to be useful. But if it's the other way around, if they're going to not deliver significant value for the effort you have to put in to kind of build that larger distributed architecture, you're going to have a bad time with microservices. And I think, that's a big part of it. Microservices is not just for scaling up performance and development teams. The difficulty level scales as well. So what I'm sort of liking to tell people now is that, if you're having problems with your monolith and you think that microservices is going to solve that for you, or microservices is going to solve all those problems, it's not. It's going to
whatever
problems you have with your monolith will be magnified.
Yeah. if you can't successfully, quickly, iteratively deploy and ship your monolithic app, you're not going to be able to do it with 20 or 30 or 50.
Yeah.
You've got to solve your hygiene first, right?
I think the experience of probably a lot of people, which results in microservices getting a bit of a bad name, is that whatever problems they have just get scaled up by however many microservices they have. But there are ways to do it where you don't have those problems, but you kind of need to solve those problems early. You can't wait till you've got 100 microservices to start solving, automated testing, automated deployment problems. You've got to have a really nice process, a really nice refined pipeline, and it's got to be rock solid as well. So, no flaky build processes, no flaky deployments. Those things can be rock solid. But I think if they're an afterthought, if you wait till they're a problem to address them, then that's when you've got like a huge problem that's going to hurt a lot just to be able to solve that problem.
Yeah.
So, I think any complex system is going to be hard. It's going to be hard to manage a complex monolith, as it grows bigger and more complicated and has more people kind of touching it, more there's so. In any development process, any project can be hard. It can be complex to get around. I think microservices can help, but only really if you've got your house in order, first. And of course, with distributed applications, you have new problems as well. There's a trend towards making systems more observable these days, and being able to better understand how things are talking to each other and how messages are passing through systems. I think that's a really good trend. It's still something that we're working on as a community. But that kind of understanding what your application is doing as a whole, and debugging the whole, obviously it scales up with microservices. So, I think that's a work in progress still. And, there's still room for improvement there.
It's absolutely essential, and you are right. The advances in observability and tracing, distributed tracing tooling, is absolutely essential now to do this. The days of grepping through log files on servers in a distributed environment is just not. That will let you down when you need it.
Yeah, for sure.
Any other major pitfalls that you see out there? I mean, some of the ones that I've seen are. The two really that I see a lot of is relying on shared databases. And the other one is making things very synchronously chatty. And people just end up with just dominoes.
I'd sort of put that in a slightly different category, but the whole shared database thing is you when you create services, you want them to be loosely coupled, right? You don't want them to be sharing details that they shouldn't be sharing, and that's how you can kind of build a system where it's easier to change one thing but not have ripple effects across the system through the different services. So that loose coupling, having them know as little about each other as possible, obviously that's completely destroyed by sharing a database. So I would say that this is the cardinal sin of microservices, is to share the database, because that completely voids any benefit you'll get from microservices. I think there's a scalability issue there. There's also you get a similar problem from using too much synchronous communication between services. You get this kind of fragile system where if one part of it breaks, the rest of it breaks, and it's I think it's what they call a distributed monolith. Have you heard that one?
Yes. Yep.
So being too synchronous, sharing a database, deploying everything in lockstep, There's plenty of ways to do microservices wrong.
Yeah, well, that's right. Those two, the synchronous and sharing, leads to you having to deploy things in a very specific way.
Yep. So one of the primary advantages of microservices is that you can deploy them independently, so that you can have separate teams working on them, and parts of the system can have kind of small deployments of microservices, and you don't have these big bang releases that you get with a monolith. But if you've got this kind of what we're talking about, this sort of distributed monolith, where it's a distributed system, but because of the way you've structured it, there's so much depends on everything else, you get these kind of these I wouldn't be surprised if you kind of fall back to kind of these big bang releases, and everything either works or it doesn't, and
Absolutely do.
and you're removing benefits like the reliability benefits and the fault isolation.
That's right. The fault tolerance goes out the window. So yeah, I mean,
I've seen as well, like what I'm thinking is an anti-pattern, and I think it's all in the name. The name microservices, I think, is just kind of wrong. Like I think because people don't really kind of get it. It's more about kind of some sort of logical single responsibility principle for the business, like not for technological concerns. And so the natural thing is, it's got to be micro, right? It's got to be micro. So make it as small as you can. So, but that often leads to these systems where the services are too small. And
yes,
and you've talked about this. I've heard you talk about services being too chatty, and I love the way you said that when you did. But there's a massive network cost to pay for these things talking to each other, and there's just the system is more complicated than it needs to be. It's more complex than it needs to be. So when you have code or a system that is more complicated than it needs to be, more complex than it needs to be, then you're putting a larger cognitive load on the people that need to kind of understand it and move it forward. So it's like a cognitive tax, really. And so that's
yes.
I think there's somewhere in between, like really small and too big. There's like a happy medium somewhere in between.
And I think where people go wrong is they get so excited about we're going to do microservices now, they forget modeling. There are some fundamentals and some basics that will never go away, no matter what the stack. And that is, you need to learn how to model your software, and you need to learn how to model your domain. And far too many people get caught up in some new fad, and they really forget about those fundamentals, because all of that is described by modeling.
It needs to be modeled around the business and and what the customers actually need from the software.
Yes.
Rather than around technical concerns. Obviously, there's going to be a ton of technical concerns that you need to deal with, but I mean you have to come to that really through that process of modeling, and to understand how you're going to kind of divide up the system the way it's going to be divided up.
Yep. And this has always been the case. This is not a new problem. It's just we repeat the same mistakes with every kind of technological evolutionary step.
But the new thing with microservices is that it's scaled up to a much bigger proportion.
Yes, costs more. Absolutely. So look, how do we do it right? You've in the book, I know you've said, look, here's a lot of the ways to do it. Like, what are some of your, 3 or 5 tips of how do we do this right?
Yep. There's a bunch of boring stuff here, that we probably don't need to talk about getting development right generally. One thing I'm a big believer in is being able to test things locally, before testing in dev, before testing in staging, before rolling it out to production. So it's like a hierarchy of testing where, it's so much easier to test locally if you can get a setup for it, that you're going to be a lot more effective if you can work locally first, before you get your PRs into dev or into the next staging after that, or QA or whatever you call it. So I think that's like, I think people have forgotten that. I think people have forgotten that, we can run these systems locally. At least, if it's a huge system, we might have to run it in some cut down form. We're running it on our local development computer. So there are ways to do that. But I think in general, people think it's an effective process to work in the cloud. And maybe it's just because we're in Australia and kind of maybe used to bad connections to the cloud, that we care more about it. I don't know. I certainly care about it anyway. Getting microservices right. I mean, I've talked about this already, but it's like, do they deliver the value that kind of outweighs their cost? Because if not, then you're guaranteed to have a bad time. And then next, you need to kind of look at your skills and experience. Like if you're learning how to do distributed applications and microservices while building your first production application, you have to learn these things. You have to make mistakes and then correct for it, right? So you have to go through a series of mistakes and failures, and that's not a bad thing. That's how we learn. That's how we should learn, and we shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes or failing. But it can be really hard to do that from nothing, from having no experience to actually doing that on a production application.
This is where we need to bring in agile principles, right? We want to fail fast and learn from that and iterate and, adapt as we learn.
I'm talking more about, I guess, as a personal developer, and this is where my kind of book can help. It can help you kind of, work through some of those early technical choices and mistakes, and plot a route to production. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about how quickly can you deliver results for the customer that work for the business. And so it's about plotting a course through the technology to basically to reach that point of success of delivering features to customers quickly. And but that's a minefield, right? Walking through the design patterns and the best practices and the silver bullets. I'm not just talking about microservices here, but walking through that technological landscape is a minefield that can take your legs off if you step on one of them. So, and again, that's what my book is for. I sort of learned the hard way, and wanted, and this is the book that I wanted myself, but it didn't exist. So there are plenty of theoretical books on building with microservices, and they're great, and I've read a bunch of those, and I love them. But they don't give you that practical guidance of how do you kind of navigate this, this treacherous pathway to actually being
getting the first one into production.
Well, it's sort of about being technically competent, because I mean there is the bar of skills are just much higher for microservices than
Well, there's a lot more. Just in the title of your book, you've got Docker, Kubernetes, GitHub Actions, and Terraform. That's a lot of pieces. It used to just be you wrote code.
Yep.
It might have gone to a build server, and then somebody put it on a server.
Yep.
Now, there's a whole ecosystem of tooling that you need to understand and make choices around how you'll get your app into production.
Yeah. But like crossing that gap, crossing that chasm is the hardest bit. But once you get some experience, and once you start to, you'll build your own toolkit of recipes of how to do this, that, and the other. And the book that I've written is full of my recipes that I've used in production. And I point out early in the book that it's just my recipes.
It's your recipe book.
like once you've gone down that road for a couple of years or more, you'll have your own complete set of recipes for all the kinds of things that work for your business and your customers and your team
and your aesthetic, your sense of style, and your taste as well. So, I mean, other than buying your book and reading your book, what should people do next if they're interested in working in microservices in their company, in their team, and they haven't done it yet?
Yep.
Read the book.
Yep.
What else? What's the next step?
I mean, if you're just learning by yourself, then practice building something. So that way you can kind of have the time and the scope, and you can make mistakes and not be under the pressure of actually having to kind of release things to production.
Learn production.
I think I'm always a big fan of having hobby projects. I mean, I've learned more from hobby projects than I have ever learned on the job, and I constantly have a hobby project on the go, and I use it to teach myself the latest things, the latest ways of working and tools and stuff like that, and then sometimes write books about it. But all that learning sort of goes into what I do day to day in production as well. It's just the day to day stuff it's got to be a lot safer. I mean, you can't take as many risks of learning new things and bringing new technologies into play. When you're working on a job that's
that's right, when customers are paying.
But if you do your own stuff on the side, you can take those risks and make really bad mistakes and have really good learning from it, and
have less fallout from them.
Yeah, that's right. In terms of bringing microservices into a company, I'd say tread very carefully, because the reality is we have a lot of choice between monolith and microservices, and also even further, you could say that functions as a service are like a step on the spectrum beyond microservices. There's a lot of choice there, and the reality is that most production applications in the wild are they're not conforming to what you think is an extreme, or what you think is an ideal for what
reality's never pretty.
Yeah, it's always a mess somewhere in the middle, and
somewhere.
But I think the tools in the book can really help those situations where
tame the mess.
Yeah, tame the mess, tame the distributed system, be set up to appreciate that it's okay to be in the middle and have, services of different sizes. Some are small, some are big, some there might be a couple of monoliths in there. I actually call it the hybrid model. So where you have like a monolith or a couple of monoliths and then a constellation of little microservices around the edge.
Yep.
And
just
I've
supporting pieces.
Yeah, I've noticed a few people starting to talk about this as well, about, it's not about which end of the spectrum you're at. It's okay to be somewhere in the middle. And be in a position where you can leverage the best of both worlds, basically. So, there's a lot of convenience about using a monolith. It's all there. It's all together. It can all be tested at once. You've got access to everything without having to do kind of asynchronous messages or REST API calls. It's a lot simpler to work with. But then, if you're set up with something like Kubernetes, you can easily pull bits out of that and
just
make
break pieces off as you need to.
As a business need arises for it. And I think, you're set for hopefully success if you can position yourself to not care about these religious wars of monolith versus microservices.
Yeah.
And actually take whatever the advantages, whatever the benefits you can from, every possible situation. And that's why I think that actually the word microservices has probably outlived its usefulness. Like, I've talked about this before on different podcasts that, it should be called right-sized services. It's like whatever is right for your situation. Like there's no microservices police out there that are going to come and look at your code and tell you your services aren't small enough.
That's right.
Stop worrying about it.
There's a lot of those terms that just get so much baggage attached to them that they lose their usefulness, right?
Yeah.
So look, to wrap up, what's next for you? Are you working on new books? Any big projects in the works? What's next?
Yeah, well, I'm currently finishing my third full book, which is called Rapid Full Stack Development. So it kind of, a bit like how Bootstrapping Microservices, sort of cross-cuts the world of distributed development. I'm trying to write a book now that basically cross-cuts the world of web application development front to back, and also talks a bit about using Electron for desktop applications and Capacitor for mobile applications using web technologies. But it's not really about what you're building. It's about how to be more effective and more productive at doing it. So that's Rapid Full Stack Development. That's what I'm finishing up at the moment. It's available now, like for a discount. So if you want to get on board, like a couple of chapters before it's finished,
early access. Yeah.
Please search for Rapid Full Stack Development. And one thing I'm toying with the idea of doing is making a video course from Bootstrapping Microservices. So if anyone is interested in how the book might translate into a video course, like a very hands-on practical thing, just like the book, then please take a look at bootstrapping-microservices.com. Sign up to the email list, and we can chat about how I can help you understand how to build distributed systems.
Amazing. All right. Well, I think that's all we've got time for today. So look, thanks very much, Ashley. That was a really interesting chat, and good luck with the second edition of the book. It's amazing.
Thank you so much.
Subscribe to the GOTO YouTube channel now and join the experts in person or online at any upcoming GOTO conference using the promo code Book Club. Visit gotopia.tech to learn more.